Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Grayzone. It's been a while. A lot has happened. It's a golden age for liberal democracy. No, actually, the mask of liberal democracy is lifting very rapidly. It's just all being torn to shreds right before our eyes. Definitely interesting times to live in. Aaron, how's it going? I'm here with Aaron Mate as always, or as usual.
How's it going, Max? How's it going, everybody? Thanks for being here. It's been a while since we did one of these, and there's a lot to catch up on. Yeah, it is a golden age of billionaire rule, and not much being done to put forward that America first foreign policy that Donald Trump promised. It's a lot of Israel first, business as usual, continuing the Biden administration's work. So that's what we're going to focus on today.
I think all of our predictions about Trump are just, which weren't that hard to make, are all coming true before our eyes. That he would expose the real truth about the U.S.-Israeli special relationship and how the tail wags the dog, that he sees powerful Jews in an anti-Semitic way and views them as power brokers that he needs in order to reign, and will do anything they ask of him. And that the Democrats wouldn't actually do anything or say anything about Gaza until Donald Trump came into office and started bellowing out crude and cretinous rants about Palestinians and ethnic cleansing and so on. It's all coming true. And it was all, again, very easy to predict. Donald Trump declared in a press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu on February 4th that the U.S. would effectively take ownership over Gaza, something a U.S. president has never said before, and that the population of Gaza would basically have to leave for a while they built a beautiful riviera. Let's take a look.
The only reason the Palestinians want to go back to Gaza is they have no alternative. The only reason the Palestinians want to go back to Gaza is they have no alternative. It's right now a demolition site. This is just a demolition site. Virtually every building is down. They're living under fallen concrete that's very dangerous and very precarious. They instead can occupy all of a beautiful area with homes and safety, and they can live out their lives in peace and harmony instead of having to go back and do it again. The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area. Do a real job, do something different. Just can't go back. If you go back, it's going to end up the same way it has for 100 years.
We're going to do a real job. He's reading prepared remarks. They come off as impromptu and classically Trump. It's like he's sort of ad-libbing with prepared remarks, which were supposedly, reportedly inspired by Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, who's Kushner from the Kushner family, which has always been close to both Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. And he Trump went on. Let's watch one more clip of Trump before any reaction. This was during a sort of fireside chat. Possibly because I have terrible internet where I am. Aaron, I don't know if you can play that one.
Yeah, sure. Here it is. I believe Netanyahu, by the way, is still in Washington. Okay. He's spending a lot of time there. Okay, here we go.
Hope that we could do Peter,
Okay.
I got it.
Peter.
Would Palestinians have the right to return if they left while the rebuilding was
It
happening?
would be my hope that we could do something really nice, really good, where they wouldn't want to return. Why would they want to return? The place has been hell. It's been one of the meanest, toughest places on earth. And right now, I've seen every picture from every angle, better than if I were there. And nobody can live there. You can't live there. So if we can build them through massive amounts of money supplied by other people, very rich nations, and they're willing to supply it. If we can build something for them in one of the countries, and it could be Jordan, and it could be Egypt, it could be other countries, and you could build 4 or 5 or 6 areas. It doesn't have to be one area, but you take certain areas and you build really good quality housing, like a beautiful town, like someplace where they can live and not die. Because Gaza is a guarantee that they're going to end up dying. The same thing's going to happen again. It's happened over and over again, and it's going to happen again as sure as you're standing there, Peter. So I hope that we could do something where they wouldn't want to go back. Who would want to go back? They've experienced nothing but death and destruction.
They've experienced nothing but death and destruction at the hands of the person who Trump is sitting next to and declines to identify as the source of all of that death and destruction. And that's the problem, or one problem hanging over all this talk, is Trump speaks as if it's some sort of natural law that Gaza will continue to face death and destruction and misery, not pointing out that the reason they face all this misery and destruction and death is because of the Israeli government, which is occupying Gaza and refuses to lift the siege. And people fight back against that. That's what happens when you're occupied. And Democrats have no response to this whatsoever. They're offended at Trump calling for ethnic cleansing, and fair enough. But they have no actual rebuttal to him because they're on board with the same agenda. They just didn't want to admit it out loud.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't able to complete that clip. I'm struggling with some internet issues where I am right now. But I'm sure I agreed with everything Aaron just said. Was Trump, can you even take Trump seriously at this point? I mean, can he be taken at his word here? The White House has walked back what he said. The White House spokeswoman, what's her name? Catherine Leavitt, walked it back to some extent and said Trump was at least not calling for U.S. soldiers to be deployed to Gaza. Marco Rubio defended Trump, but just simply said we are going to make Gaza beautiful. And I think after Lindsey Graham came in, one of the biggest Zionist fanatics in Congress, who is always been on the Armed Services Committee in the Senate, high-ranking, at a high rank on the Armed Services Committee from South Carolina, which has a disproportionate number of troops among its population on military bases, and basically put the kibosh on sending U.S. troops to take over Gaza. Outrage poured in from the MAGA movement about the concept of using American troops to do Israel's dirty work, the sense that they had been rugged by Donald Trump. But can you even take Trump seriously when he's not operating on the same plane of reality as I think the rest of us are? And it's always been unclear whether he's trying to set the stage for some kind of negotiation or frighten everyone.
I think he's just, the biggest problem to me about what Trump said is it's not what he said, because he's not going to do that. He's not going to send U.S. troops to occupy Gaza. He won't. We all know that. It's what he doesn't say. He doesn't say Palestinians have the right to self-determination in their own land. And he's endorsing the Netanyahu plan to expel people and not let them come back, even when Netanyahu claims that they'll be able to come back after they leave. And that's the problem here. And it's taken now there's a baseline in U.S. media and U.S. political culture where it's just taken for granted now that Palestinians don't have the right to self-determination anymore. They don't talk about that. Now it's like, well, Trump is coming up with a creative solution, but let's hear what others have to say. Everyone else says the same thing. Palestinians have the right to self-determination, but that's now a non-starter in Washington. And it's not just Trump that's advancing that message. That was Joe Biden as well, who paid lip service to a Palestinian state, but did nothing to stop Israel from destroying that prospect. So to me, Trump is just crudely expressing what has now become a de facto position inside Washington, which is that Israel can destroy Gaza, can prevent it from rebuilding. That already was the case even before October 7th with the siege, where Israel would not let Palestinians develop their own society inside Gaza and would block reconstruction after previous massacres. And that's the new reality. Trump is saying to Palestinians, you can leave. That's your option. That's your only option, is to leave. And we're not going to let you rebuild. We're not going to let you have a functioning society.
Yeah. This has always been at the heart of Zionism. And so in a way, it's sort of refreshing to hear an American president express what was always the sort of the base logic of Zionism. Let me get something on screen that I think will really help people understand where this is coming from. And you know, who Trump is trying to please here. This is Meir Kahana's book. Rabbi Meir Kahana, They Must Go. How long can Israel survive its malignant and growing Arab population? In this manifesto, Rabbi Meir Kahana sets forth the only plan for Israel's salvation. And this is now a view shared by the majority of Israelis. Meir Kahana, who was an American far-right rabbi and FBI informant who was basically paid to stir up trouble between Black New Yorkers and Jewish New Yorkers, who founded the Jewish Defense League, which was basically a domestic terrorist group, moved to Israel, started the Kach Party, which was outlawed by Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud because it was seen as sort of a competitor and a rival. That was the real logic behind that. But Kahana really hit on something that was so powerful that reverberated for generations. And we've seen his acolytes like Itamar Ben-Gvir rise to top-level cabinet positions in Netanyahu's cabinet, helping him hold his coalition together. Kahana declared that there's no such thing as a Jewish and democratic state. Being a Jewish state and a democratic state is irreconcilable, not because necessarily there's anything inherent about Judaism that makes it anathema to democracy. But if you have a democratic state, then you're granting rights to the indigenous Palestinian population, which will allow them to grow and outbreed the Jewish population, which does not proselytize as Muslims do. And therefore, you will have effectively an apartheid state with a minority governing a majority. At some point, unless you ethnically cleanse, you transfer the Palestinian population. And so therefore, they must go. He wanted to clear them out before the crisis festered to a point where it metastasized. And now most Jewish Israelis, including like opposition figures like Benny Gantz, who have endorsed Trump's proposal to the extent that it is a proposal, agree with the Kahanist vision for Israel. And this was put forward by the Institute for, Institute for Zionist Studies inside Israel. It's a Likudnik think tank that, supports Netanyahu. They put forward a plan for ethnically cleansing the population of Gaza after October 7th, following adequate destruction. But a series of other plans have emerged too. One, which is actually uploaded by Netanyahu's own office onto his website, which I think Trump may have viewed, something that Jared Kushner would definitely want to get in on. And it's a plan, it's the post-war plan for Gaza, which I will try to like crudely translate and just go over really quickly. And this is what I think what Trump was doing was presenting an amalgamation of Kahanism and this plan, which is called Gaza 2035. And it's based on Mohammed bin Salman's Project Neom, which plans to put resorts and high-speed rail along the Red Sea and develop the Red Sea all the way up to Israel's Eilat. So Netanyahu got a team together to put this forward as the continuation of Mohammed bin Salman's plan, economic integration, what we'll see with the Abraham Accords. And of course, it includes Gaza's decimation as a prerequisite for its fulfillment. This is the PowerPoint. So it's Gaza 2035. And here you can see the map beginning along the Red Sea. Looks like the Houthis, Ansar Allah, is going to have to be decimated as well for this to work. And then you can see from Petra to the Mediterranean, it's kind of like a Belt and Road infrastructure project that continues all the way to the Mediterranean, which dovetails with various proposals put forward by like imperialist think tanks in Washington, like CSIS, for U.S. domination of the Mediterranean. And here's the four-point plan. First, like you can see on the right, the destruction of Gaza. Hamas, it's like Hamas is eliminated. Then it says humanitarian aid. Basically, the population is separated between the irreconcilables who support Hamas, who will be like liquidated or placed in concentration camps in the Negev, which is currently what's happening with the population that was kidnapped out of Gaza. And then rebuilding. And then finally, basically like the utopia in 2035. It looks like the United Arab Emirates. It looks like Dubai on the sea. Amazing. And this will all be done under Israeli leadership in partnership with the Arab states. And it's presented as win-win. A win-win for Israel because it gets security. The U.S. it gets regional leadership for Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Enormous amounts of economic opportunity. And of course, they're going to be the de facto authority or providing the funding for the Palestinian Authority that will rule. Other countries like Egypt get economic opportunities in the Sinai Peninsula. The Palestinians will be de-radicalized and, they'll live in beautiful homes on the Riviera, just as Trump said. And for other countries in the region, like Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, it will be like a model where they will clear out their resistance factions, destroy them, and then they will begin to rebuild too, according to this plan led by Israel, the U.S., and its sellout partners in the Gulf. And then here's the infrastructure map with all these ports. A Gaza Marine port. That's interesting because there are gas deposits right out there in the Mediterranean. So Gaza's gas will be stolen by the quote unquote international community led by Israel and business consortiums led by Jared Kushner. And then, wow, it looks like paradise. What's going on here? Look in the lower left-hand corner. That's a Tesla, or it's meant to look like a Tesla. And they're building an electric car plant in Gaza using what it says here is relatively cheap Gazan labor. So Gaza basically becomes a slave class for the Arab rulers who are themselves basically ruled by Israel and the US. Paradise. This is the Riviera Trump was talking about. It was all uploaded on Netanyahu's website. So it's this concept that I think was presented to Trump, and he added his own Kahanist, crude colonial flair to it. I don't know if he meant it at all, but it's inspired a lot of people to actually, surprising amount of people to actually defend and support him. One of them, Ben Shapiro, top pro-Likud influencer in the U.S., who himself wrote an essay back when he was a sort of child actor for the conservative movement called "Transfer is Not a Dirty Word." You can look it up right now. He wrote it for Town Hall. He retracted it or claimed he was like just overcome by zeal as a young virgin Likudnik, but now he seems to favor it again. So basically what Trump has done here, whether he means it or not, is he has legitimized this kind of rhetoric of ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, the Biden administration was smarter about it. They just tried to do it behind the scenes. Anthony Blinken went quietly to Egypt and Jordan and tried to get them to accept Palestinians from Gaza under the guise of being, welcoming to refugees out of humanitarian concerns. And Trump is now openly saying they should leave, and he wouldn't commit to letting them come back because he doesn't want to have them come back. He even said, who would Gaza be for after you rebuilt it? He said the people of the world, by which he means wealthy people of the world plus migrant laborers, like other favorite wealthy enclaves of his. So that's the plan. And the question is
the final solution. It's the Madagascar plan.
Yeah.
Look up the Madagascar plan. That was the Nazi plan for removing Jews to Madagascar. This is the same thing.
So the question now is, what political force is going to stand up against this? Democrats, some of them voiced outrage at this. So did some Republicans too. But who is actually going to stand up anymore in Washington for Palestinians' right to self-determination? Jesse Jackson once did that when he was like the first major political figure to do that in the U.S. He was attacked for it. Then in the 1990s, the Clinton administration pretended to care about Palestinian self-determination, but they were never serious about it. So it's like we have two parties. One of them pretends to support, or the Democrats generally pretend to support Palestinian self-determination even when they don't. And Trump, who's now no longer even bothering to pretend. The Bush administration pretended too. George W. Bush called for a Palestinian state, which of course he didn't mean. So now Trump has totally lifted off the mask. But what next? And what next for Gaza? People will not be leaving voluntarily. But I mean, the problem is Trump is correct that it is unlivable. I mean, even before October 7th, the UN was warning it was going to be unlivable within a few years. Israel's done everything it can to bring that, to accelerate that timeline by leaving it destroyed. And many people aren't going to be able to live there. So where are they going to go? Why can't they go to their original homes back in 1948 Palestine, from which they were expelled? Well, that's a non-starter for Israel and the U.S. But then it's, why can't they go to the West Bank at least while their homes in Gaza are being rebuilt? And they can't go there because Israel's stealing their land there too and filling it with Jewish settlers who are on a continued rampage, displacing thousands of people there too. This gets overlooked because Gaza has been such a hellhole at Israel's hands, but settlers in the West Bank have displaced thousands of Palestinians. Settlers and Israeli soldiers have displaced thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank too.
Well, it's a no-go for Egypt and Jordan. The Egyptian upper middle class and upper class does not want Palestinians in their midst, sees them in many ways the same way that Zionists see them, as kind of troublemakers, as a problem that they should have nothing to do with. And this encompasses a large part of the military elite in Egypt, including Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the leader of the military junta that controls Egypt, who's, after what happened in Syria, very troubled by the prospect of a kind of Muslim Brotherhood insurgency or Muslim Brotherhood protest movement in Egypt. I mean, there's a lot of economic dissatisfaction in Egypt right now. And he said, this cannot work. We can't let them into the Sinai. Jordan is a neo-colonial backwater created by the British with a kind of quasi-British king, a Hashemite king ruling over a majority Palestinian population who experienced more political pressure in the streets after October 7th with huge protests in Amman than he had at any time since Jordan experienced Black September, when it purged the PLO violently. And his government exists heavily off US and EU donations, including USAID pumping money into this whole network of NGOs in Jordan that create this kind of parallel colonial economy. I mean, it's existential for them. They're not going to allow this. I don't know what they can do to resist Trump, but they're not going to allow it. And I think the Trump administration is going to put pressure on them. Who will fight for Palestinian self-determination? Well, the Democrats are doing some performative tirades. Alvin Green's calling to impeach Trump again. They never do this. They don't care about Gaza. The only groups that will fight for them are in the axis of resistance, which have suffered enormous casualties taking on Israel since October 7th. And I mean, we can talk about it later, but Israel's violating the ceasefire in Lebanon again. It's attacking all around Lebanon, trying to create divisions in Lebanon between Hezbollah and the rest of the population. The stage has been set for another war, for more conflict. And meanwhile, Trump is legitimizing ethnic cleansing. I mean, look at the way the New York Times has responded to Donald Trump's call for a large portion of the Palestinian population to leave. This is by Stephen Erlanger, who's one of their top Middle East correspondents. President Trump's proposal to own Gaza and transfer its population elsewhere has stirred condemnation and sarcasm, but it is an opening bid and could disrupt the tired diplomatic paradigm. Wow, Trump's a disruptor. And he's introducing fresh new ideas on the table. And this is according to Chuck Freilich, a former Israeli deputy national security advisor. So they don't interview any Palestinians in this article.
Of course
it
not.
may force the sides to reconsider long-held positions, stir things up dramatically, and lead to new openings. And Ali Abunimah flagged this. There's more. Murdoch Media in Australia is pumping up Trump's plan. The Daily Telegraph. Trump in a stunning Gaza takeover. And there's a fluttering American flag behind the ruins of Gaza, stars and strip. It's awesome. It's bringing hope and joy to Gaza. This is the Australian, another Murdoch paper, ultimate Gaza gambit. Trump stuns world with plan for ownership of war-torn strip. Trump is a bold visionary. Others, Dennis Ross, longtime peace processor, Israeli lobby mole in the Clinton peace process team for like over a decade, said, he went on Twitter and said, you don't like this plan? Well, why don't the Arabs come up with something better? If you don't have a better plan, then just be quiet and let Trump start cooking. So,
and this is just straight Orwellian, because everyone, including Dennis Ross, knows the Arab states have a plan. It's been offered to Israel forever. The Arab Peace Initiative. It's very simple. It's Israel withdraws from the West Bank and Gaza and lets Palestinians have a state in just 22% of their historic homeland. Big compromise for Palestinians, accepting just 22% of your land. That's what all the Arab states have offered Israel, a big compromise. And Israel, with U.S. backing, doesn't even consider it to be a basis for negotiation. Netanyahu dismissed it out of hand because they're just committed to stealing whatever land they want. And everyone pretends that solution is not already out there and could have been achieved. And even Seymour Hersh actually recently reported this, that, and I didn't know this, Hassan Nasrallah, the late leader of Hezbollah, had always stayed silent publicly on this. So I never knew what he said. But Hersh says that Nasrallah told him that if that's what Palestinians agreed to, that he wouldn't stand in the way. So the only people standing in the way of this big Palestinian compromise offered by all the Arab states was Israel and the U.S. And Barack Obama could have taken this up. George W. Bush could have taken this up. Joe Biden could have taken this up. And of course, Trump could have taken this up. But no one wants to, because no one wants to challenge Israel's self-professed right to steal whatever Arab land it wants.
And with clear reasons. I mean, it's clear why. Why was Dennis Ross leading the negotiating team? This is someone who came in from WINEP, a think tank that was founded out of what organization? AIPAC. Dennis Ross is just the product of Zionist billionaire and millionaire money legally bribing U.S. politicians to take him on as an expert so he could displace the quote-unquote Arabists from the George H.W. Bush administration. And the peace process was subsequently used just to buy Israel time, guarantee it maximum Palestinian land and endless U.S. aid under the guise that it was working for peace, while refusing to set borders. And at the end of the day, what did you get? The siege of Gaza, brutal wars on Gaza, the apartheid wall in the West Bank, and Israel got to declare, well, we have no Palestinian partner. But it was all bought and paid for basically by Israel's cutouts in the US. And so Israel's cutouts in the US have basically bought and paid for Donald Trump's comments. Donald Trump said, Miriam and Sheldon Adelson spent more time in the White House meeting with me than any other of my supporters. And they got what they paid for. And, I think that's what this really symbolizes. The golden pager was, this is disgusting. This was presented to Donald Trump by Benjamin Netanyahu. It's a golden pager, an Apollo pager, modeled after the pagers that we all know were infiltrated by Mossad agents and planted with explosives to detonate, and on over 3,000 users. Many of them were like Hezbollah reservists, but also children and first responders were badly injured and killed by these pagers. And it was put on an old cedar tree trunk or an olive tree trunk, probably stolen from Palestinians, to Donald J. Trump, our greatest friend and greatest ally, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. What's your take on this pager?
It just underscores that Netanyahu is the personification of smug evil. He loves to just flash what a sociopath he is. And Trump is fine with debasing himself by accepting this and celebrating this. This terror attack that was used to, kill and maim children in Lebanon, and they're fine to openly celebrate it. It just speaks again to the complete normalization of sadism, if it's done at the behest of Israel. No other foreign leader, I think, could get away with doing something like this.
No.
Maybe Zelensky back when his currency, his cachet was a lot higher, but not anymore. But Israel always has a past to flash its depravity in Washington.
Yeah, this is another level. And it really deserves like academic inquiry, like a PhD level paper, except most academic PhDs produce nothing but garbage. What this says about the special relationship. There's so many meanings. You could read it as a threat. He's handing Trump an assassination device, like press with both hands, like, oh, you could just, kill yourself with this. We're giving you something that was used to kill many people who we saw as enemies. Could also be seen as a back channel. We're going to communicate with you outside normal channels, away from your NSC and your advisors, and basically give you orders through a pager. And it also reminded me of the golden telephone from The Godfather, which just symbolized mafia lineage and corruption. Do you remember that?
I don't remember that, actually. This is in The Godfather 1?
I think it appears throughout, but it mainly appears with Michael Corleone.
Okay.
But I learned something interesting, which I rarely do, from Quora, which is that the golden telephone that Mario Puzo conceived for The Godfather was actually inspired by a real telephone given to Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1957 from ITT, International Telephone and Telegraph, because Batista agreed to raise rates on mostly poor Cubans on behalf of that company to increase their profits, which was like the role that he typically played. And a Batista-like figure appears in The Godfather, in Godfather 2.
Godfather 2, yeah.
Where Hyman Roth, who is supposed to be Meyer Lansky, who actually had to flee Cuba and ran the Riviera Hotel in Havana. He's based on Meyer Lansky. Hyman Roth was, in with the Batista character and then had to flee as well. So I don't know if Trump or Netanyahu understood the clear Godfather reference here, but it really reminds me of it's just sheer depravity, proudly proclaimed. I don't know if Trump could have refused that gift. But I think that everyone who runs for president, who's a real contender or front runner, knows if they step too far outside the playbook that's been presented to them by Israel and its cutouts in Washington, they face a pager-style operation in the future.
And this is where I'd ask MAGA people, is this what you voted for?
Yeah.
Someone who constantly humiliates himself and his country at the behest of Israel. Is this America first? Where's the pushback on this from inside MAGA? Is MAGA an actual political movement, or is it a cult? I mean, there are some people who challenge this, like Tucker Carlson has been critical more vocally recently of Israel, and but aside from that, I see very little outrage about that. I mean, maybe I've missed something, but where's the whole concept of America first? It's just completely absent when the topic is Israel.
Well, Steve Bannon, actually, since you brought it up, made some comments that related directly to this. Let's turn to the man who conceived America First as a Trumpian brand.
Freaking out because the constituents are calling. That's just to find out where the money is in the system. Now we have to have cuts. You cannot cut a penny from federal spending unless you start in the Defense Department. Let me say this again. Let's have an adult conversation. Unless you start in the Defense Department, you cannot.
Actually, I'm mistaken. He was talking about something else and had nothing. I don't think he had anything to say about this. So, Steve Bannon's a huge Zionist who said that the first Trump administration would be the most pro-Israel administration ever. We'll go back to his comments on USAID. I think I got it wrong. Those comments were about USAID. You're not seeing it from key MAGA influencers. You're certainly not seeing it from Charlie Kirk, who is an Israel lobby plant, who his whole career has been funded by pro-Israel donors, but he poses as America first. So what is MAGA? What is it? Do they simply see Israel as part of America, as Donald Trump seems to do? This is the view of Christian Zionists. Do they not understand that U.S. and Israeli interests are not aligned, and that war with Iran would be absolutely disastrous for U.S. interests and would cause oil prices to go through the roof as U.S. oil infrastructure came under attack in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere? They don't seem to understand that it increasingly looks like a cult. And it's not like they've been rugged. Like we did our last stream on what was to come, highlighting Miriam Adelson's role seated right behind Donald Trump in a better seat than all members of Congress and many cabinet secretaries. What was she doing there? It's because she basically, right before getting rid of Luka Doncic, bribed Donald Trump in exchange for the West Bank and possibly the ethnic cleansing of Gaza.
Well, we need to capitalize on the outrage among Dallas Mavericks fans.
Yeah.
The betrayal they suffered at the hands of Mary Adelson, and maybe, build that up into a movement against the Adelson agenda. That's what we can all start in Dallas, because they sold out their fan base by dealing one of the best basketball players in the league. Maybe that's a place to start fomenting some opposition to the Adelson agenda. It's she gets a prime seat on stage. Trump brags, as you mentioned, about giving the Adelsons whatever they want. In the first term, it was the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem and recognition of Israel's theft of the Syrian Golan Heights. And now it's calling openly for Palestinians to leave and not come back, and to build up resorts in their place.
If it could come out that Miriam Adelson had just emptied the tank on bribing Donald Trump, and that's why they had to unload Luka, who had like what a $350 million 3-year salary coming up. If that came out, that would actually be like one of the most damaging things for the Israel lobby in the US, because like American men don't really care about the stuff we're talking about, but they know everything about sports.
Yeah. And so if Mary Nelson didn't want to pay this superstar basketball player so she could spend that money on funding settlements and bribing politicians for Israel, that actually could be a scandal. Yeah. It probably is that. Honestly, that's probably, she probably was like, why would I pay this guy $350 million when I could spend that money, building, I don't know, a new settlement or bribing yet another politician for Israel, which is her top priority.
Yeah. The real conspiracy, I think, is that the NBA owners who rely so much on TV ratings for revenue don't care about winning. They care about revenue. And ratings were down, so they needed some kind of reality show drama to spice things up for the league. Bring Luka to a major media market. That'll help. And now suddenly people are interested in the NBA. Look, it's even being discussed on the Grayzone. So, I mean, it shows kind of the NBA to be just a sham. It's not like the great golden age of the 80s and 90s when there were just these epic battles between teams and the owners wanted to win at all costs. Because it doesn't make sense otherwise. And it is kind of emblematic of how all of our institutions operate. Just doesn't make sense to people why they're doing what they're doing. But beyond that, here's one MAGA protest against from a major MAGA influencer, Jack Posobiec, against Donald Trump's Israel first agenda. I want to develop East Palestine. This was the day after Trump called to develop Gaza. Yeah, I mean, this is what you would expect from the sons of Pat Buchanan, isolationists, people who don't want to spend tons of money building firehouses and condominiums in the Sinai Peninsula. Like, why would they want to spend their money doing that? But it's a pretty meek protest. And it really, I mean, I don't know. Tucker Carlson was seen entering the White House. I don't know what he was doing there. It was very rare and unusual. He was seen entering the White House yesterday, soon after this episode. And he's someone who's been speaking out more and more about the contradictions in the special relationship and getting attacked by Israel lobbyists. So maybe pressure is bearing down on Trump. I would be sure, though, and I actually have heard this from some people who are like peripherally around White House circles, that Mike Waltz is pushing for a strike on Iran. I mean, I really think that we can't allow ourselves to get so focused on Trump's rhetoric when the agenda continues to move towards a strike on Iran, when the Gaza ceasefire has not reached phase 2, when Israel's violating the ceasefire in Lebanon and trying to reignite conflict there. This whole thing could erupt again, and it's all heading straight back to Iran. Iran released footage. I don't have it in our notes, so I don't have it ready in front of me, but Iran's military released footage for the first time of new S-300 missile batteries and Iranian-made anti-aircraft systems because they're worried. And they're also clearly sending signals that they want to deal with Trump.
And Trump said when he signed another executive order renewing so-called maximum pressure, he's like, I don't want to do this. I didn't want to do this. I had to. I kind of had no choice. He expressed some kind of regret about having to, continue a campaign to put maximum pressure on ordinary Iranian civilians by imposing sanctions that make their lives deliberately difficult. But again, this is where, same as Israel, Palestine, Biden did the exact same thing. Biden continued Trump's maximum pressure campaign. And there's still, it seems, the one difference I can see right now in Washington is that, or in political culture, is like now MSNBC and CNN Now they'll interview more Palestinians, like who are
Yeah.
actually on the ground, like in Gaza, inside 1948, Palestine, inside the West Bank. So people like Diana Boutou, who was shut out of places like MSNBC, or at least most of the MSNBC shows. Now she's being interviewed again on MSNBC because Trump's in office, and so it's okay now to criticize the White House now that it's no longer Biden. So that's one difference that we're seeing. But where's the actual pushback inside Washington? It's non-existent, with the exception of people like Rashida Tlaib, who had a consistent message. But otherwise, Democrats can pretend to be offended by Trump's call for ethnic cleansing, but it was their policy too. They just didn't say it out loud.
Well, let's quickly cover the hypocrisy here. I mean, this is Biden's former press secretary who wanted to be his secretary, and they put her out to pasture by giving her an MSNBC show that nobody watched. I mean, literally nobody watched it. Simone Sanders Townsend. I think now it's very appropriate to reiterate that elections have consequences. I think now it's very appropriate. It's like I'm supposed to read that. I can't read that in my own voice. It's just so condescending. It's written minutes after Trump's comments began to reverberate through corporate media. And she's wagging her finger at Arab Americans, at people who wouldn't vote for Kamala Harris because of the genocide in Gaza. And elections do have consequences. Donald Trump was elected and a ceasefire followed immediately in Gaza. And the killing that had been initiated under the watch of Joe Biden and continued under the watch of Biden and Kamala Harris stopped. I mean, I'm so glad that I am not waking up every day to images of dead children and going to bed every night to images of more dead children. Things are horrible in Gaza. What Donald Trump's rhetoric was cretinous and barbaric. But Kamala Harris and Joe Biden were responsible for the slaughter of those children. They created an air bridge that delivered an unprecedented level of weaponry delivered to Israel. 85,000 tons of explosives were detonated on the Gaza Strip by October. So in 1 year, I don't know how many nuclear bombs that is, but in the first 3 months of the conflict, more than the bombs that had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were detonated over Gaza. That was done by the Democrats. There was no protest in Congress. There was no call for Biden's impeachment. Now we have Al Green calling for the impeachment of Donald Trump for his words.
Mr. Speaker, and I rise today, Mr. Speaker, with a to whom it may concern message. To whom it may concern, ethnic cleansing in Gaza is not a joke, especially when it emanates from the President of the United States, the most powerful person in the world, when he has the ability to perfect what he says. Ethnic cleansing in Gaza is no joke, and the Prime Minister of Israel should be ashamed, knowing the history of his people, to stand there and allow such things to be said. Ethnic cleansing has been a crime against humanity. And I stand here today in the well to denounce what was said, to denounce what the president said, to denounce the complicity of the Prime Minister of Israel, and to remind people that Dr. King was right. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And injustice.
All right. I mean, that's a great speech. Great rhetoric. And why did we have to wait till there was a ceasefire and a new president to hear it? Because you couldn't say that under a Democrat. You couldn't say that when Kamala Harris was running for president. You couldn't say it when Joe Biden was running for president. And Al Green was one of the better members of Congress with his votes. He voted against the massive military aid package to Israel. but we didn't hear that, he went to the mountaintop rhetoric invoking Martin Luther King to denounce the president and calling out ethnic cleansing. So again, like, maybe this is a positive development. Now that we have Donald Trump, the Democrats will actually resist ethnic cleansing and will stand up for civil rights. Remember when I tried to interview Al Sharpton at the Democratic convention about the Democratic Party sponsored Holocaust in Gaza? He just walked away from me. He seemed deeply uncomfortable. Now Al Sharpton would have no qualms about condemning Trump and Netanyahu. Well, maybe. I don't know who's lining his pockets, but
they certainly made a strong case for keeping them out of the White House if you care about Palestine. Because when they had the White House, people like AOC, one of the most progressive members of Congress, went before a national audience and lied that the government, that Biden and Kamala Harris were tirelessly working towards a ceasefire. Would AOC ever lie on behalf of Donald Trump to say he's doing anything positive while he's presiding over ethnic cleansing? No. So if you're going to lie to cover up for a White House that is enabling mass murder and ethnic cleansing, if they're Democratic, then you're making the argument that it's better if you're in the opposition, because at least you wouldn't do that if it was Donald Trump in the White House. So they strongly made that case. And by the way, that rhetoric of lying about Biden working for a ceasefire, Biden and Kamala Harris working for a ceasefire while the genocide is ongoing, that's just as offensive as Trump calling for ethnic cleansing now that there's been a ceasefire. I mean, it's really offensive to pretend as if Biden's trying to end the war when he's enabling it. So Democrats, it's like the Democratic argument is that basically people who care about Palestine and genocide have to accept that we're going to be complicit in genocide, and that's just how it has to be. But we're going to not be so hateful, openly hateful with our rhetoric, and we're going to maybe fund UNRWA and humanitarian relief programs for Palestinians a little bit more than Trump would. That's the bargain that Democrats are asking us to accept. But you have to be okay with us enabling genocide. Enough people in this election finally said, forget it. Like, we're not going to vote for you anymore just because of the scraps you occasionally offer Palestinians in between funding their extermination.
The Democrats are more effective at advancing Israeli interests while appearing like there's some daylight between the U.S. and Israel. They're more effective at bamboozling the American public. And here's a perfect, here's some new evidence that proves my point. The point that I made to Tony Blinken, which I never could have if I hadn't interrupted his final press conference, that a ceasefire deal was there for at least 8 months, that Hamas had accepted it. And here is the former defense minister of the Israeli military, an architect of genocide, Yoav Gallant, confirming exactly what I said, that a deal was there since July. It was actually there since May, and it may have been there since October if anyone was serious about making a deal with Hamas. But let's take the most conservative interpretation here from the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, that thousands and thousands of people were allowed to die in order to prevent the deal from coming about. And it was Tony Blinken who prevented it, along with the rest of the Democrats. Let's talk about the hostages. Did Israel do as much as it could to get them back? We could have brought back more at a lower cost, Gallant says. The agreement we see unfolding these days is, broadly speaking, according to the Americans, according to the cabinet secretary, the same deal that was on the table in May, which you supported. The proposal that Hamas agreed to in early July was identical to the current proposal, except it was worse in several ways. Unfortunately, there are fewer hostages still alive now. More time has passed, and we are paying a heavier price. So, I just don't think there's any way you can make people ashamed of not voting for Joe Biden, who would have been part of the Democratic constituency. That's my
Kamala Harris, yeah.
I'm sorry, Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
Or Joe Biden, but
yeah,
definitely Kamala Harris. Where is she now? They said, Jill Stein just went away. Like, you hear from Jill Stein all the time if you're paying attention. Like, Jill Stein just runs every 4 years and she went away. Where is Kamala Harris? Like, the last time I saw her before she appeared really like petulant at Trump's inauguration. But the last time I saw her before that, she appeared intoxicated. So I don't know. These just aren't serious people. And they're trying to wag their fingers at us. It's really infuriating. It's outrageous. It reminds me of why I truly hate them. Moving on. We have some breaking news. I mean, it's not that breaking, but and we don't know what's going to happen. It's more like a breaking announcement.
And we're going to be doing more and more of that. We're going to be looking at Department of Education. We're going to be looking at, and we're going to be doing more and more of that. We're going to be looking at Department of Education. We're going to be looking at even our military. We're going to be looking at tremendous amounts of money, Peter, being spent on things that bear no relationship to anything and have no value. We're talking about trillions of dollars. It will be, in the end, trillions of dollars being absolutely wasted, and perhaps illegally. I would say certainly in many cases illegally, but perhaps illegally overall. And I'm very proud of the job that this group of young people, generally young people, but very smart people, they're doing. They're doing it at my insistence. It would be a lot easier not to do it, but we have to take some of these things apart to find the corruption. We found tremendous corruption.
So Donald Trump is talking about the next targets of Doge. The Department of Government Efficiency, named for a meme coin introduced by Elon Musk. And it's now being led by young people, including one, these kind of Adderall-fueled Musk employees, including one alias Big Balls, who was fired for naughty social media postings. And, he's saying we will go after the Department of Education and military. Does that mean the Pentagon? They're actually going to do what they just did to USAID to the Pentagon? We'll talk about USAID and the history of USAID. But since Trump has mentioned this, Elon Musk has benefited handsomely from corporate welfare from the Pentagon. That's partly why he is so wealthy. I mean, billions of dollars to fund all of his projects, some of which blew up in midair, many of which blew up in midair. And so I question whether the Doge staffer alias Big Balls would live up to his name and go after the Pentagon, which is it's the most corrupt entity in human history. Probably. I mean, maybe unless you consider Wall Street an entity. But there's just so much bloat there, so much waste, so much opacity. How many audits has the Pentagon refused to conduct or failed? 7?
I've lost track, but Pete Hegseth, the new defense secretary, he just said that his goal is that by the end of his term, his 4-year term in office, that the Pentagon is able to pass one audit. He did lay that out as a goal, as if like it should be even like something that you should like see as like not a requirement. Instead, it's aspirational that we be able to pass an audit. But that's how corrupt and bloated the Pentagon is, that it's like seen as like it would be some sort of achievement if the Pentagon could pass an audit.
It's never passed an audit. And what you would find there if you directed like real energy would be so shocking to the US taxpayer. But they don't understand the whole US economy since World War II has been fueled by the military industry. And I mean, FDR understood this during World War II, that in a capitalist system, you cannot develop with state sponsorship a massive military industry needed to win a world war unless you incentivize it for the business chieftains, the power elite. Otherwise, they'll turn on you and coup you out. They'll coup you out, and they won't participate. So incentivizing means you let them skim massive amounts off the top through contracts. They keep the money. They dole it out to their accountant, their managers, their employees get, McMansions in the suburbs. And that system has really prevailed since World War II, to the point where the Pentagon budget is closing in on $1 trillion. But trillions of dollars are lost and missing from the budget, and the public has no idea where it's going. So what they're focusing on right now is basically a lemonade stand compared to the Pentagon. But it's still important. USAID, it's still important to focus on USAID. We at the Grayzone have been covering USAID ever since we existed as a CIA front organization. And the old timers following this stream right now, those of you who lived through the good old days of the Church Commission might remember old Dan Mitrione, the USAID contractor who was sent to instruct the right-wing dictatorship of Paraguay in torture tactics, and was kidnapped by the Tupamaro guerrillas and held hostage until he was eventually killed. His cover was USAID, and he was there to help Operation Condor develop and to crush the socialist and communist left across South America. And that's really the essence of USAID. Those of you who don't remember that episode, go watch State of Siege, great film by one of the greatest political directors in human history, Costa Gavras. And that's the story of Dan Mitrione of USAID. But we're told now that what Trump has done to USAID is preventing children from being fed in Africa. And, all these children across the world are going to die. But USAID is something that's participated in killing. And actually, Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut admitted this at a massive protest outside USAID headquarters, filled with Democrats and young liberals who didn't protest the Gaza genocide and didn't get out in the streets for anything in the past 4 years. They're now up in arms because their website at USAID has gone offline and their funding has been frozen as DOJ investigates. Here's Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut.
The senator from Connecticut, Senator Chris Murphy.
So Elon Musk has been floating all sorts of awful, terrible conspiracy theories about what happens at USAID. Let's make it very clear that every single day, America is safer because of what happens at USAID.
Notice there's Ilhan Omar to his left nodding along.
USAID fights terrorist groups all across this world, making sure that we address the underlying causes for a retreat to terrorism. USAID chases China all around the world, making sure that China doesn't monopolize contracts for critical minerals and port infrastructure all around the world. It supports freedom fighters everywhere in this world. Up until yesterday, delivering firewood, for instance, to the brave Ukrainian defenders on the Eastern Front.
Yeah.
This reminds me of when he admitted right after the coup in Ukraine. This reminds me of when he admitted right after the coup in Ukraine in 2014 that we played an instrumental role in this. If not for our involvement in Ukraine, this change of regime wouldn't have happened. That's what Chris Murphy said back in 2014 after the government of Yanukovych was overthrown, setting off this whole current mess in Ukraine that we're still currently mired in. So this is another admission from Murphy about the real purposes of USAID. I have no doubt that some important things are being targeted by Musk, like, the criticism that this affected AIDS treatment for people in Africa. That, yeah. I mean, I have no doubt that obviously, like, Elon Musk is not taking his cost cutting to 100% like nefarious things. There's obviously some genuine humanitarian aid being cut up in this. But what Democrats are totally obscuring is what the rest of the world knows, that USAID is used for the very nefarious purposes that Murphy kind of admitted to right there. It's not about delivering aid. It's about destabilizing countries that are marked for regime change.
Yeah. And even PEPFAR is a soft power program that's meant to signal that we actually care about Africa while we prevent strong states from developing their own healthcare systems. Samantha Power also echoed Chris Murphy. This was the head at the time of USAID. She's since been fired and is soon to appear at some kind of sleazy consulting firm on K Street or at an Ivy League university. Probably.
I mean, she's saying that I'm supposed to be a funny show, and that is probably the funniest thing seen on the Stephen Colbert Show in a long time. Countries are bullied into going along with the U.S., and that's what people like Samantha Power have done. You can read about it in WikiLeaks, and USAID is involved in this, bullying Haiti, for example, into lowering its minimum wage. That's what diplomats like Samantha Power have been up to around the world. And that's what she's lamenting, is the fact that Elon Musk might be putting an end to that. But which I actually doubt. The thing is, I don't think Elon Musk and Trump, they're going to go after the really nefarious things that USAID does. I mean, in some cases, I'm sure some of it will be touched. Like we've seen in Ukraine, people complaining that these so-called independent media outlets aren't being funded anymore because, but then you have to ask yourself, how are you an independent outlet in Ukraine if the U.S. government is funding you? But I don't think Elon Musk and Trump are actually going to take the proverbial axe to the real shady things that USAID does. It's more that they're touting how they're going after so-called woke programs, which are relatively trivial compared to what USAID really does around the world.
Well, here is Reporters Without Borders. And we're supposed to be outraged by this. In Ukraine, 9 out of 10 media outlets rely on USAID funding. In Ukraine, where 9 of 10 media outlets rely on USAID funding, several local media have already announced the suspension of their activities and are searching for alternative solutions. At Slidsvo .info, 80% of our budget is affected. Anna Babinet, CEO and co-founder of the independent investigative media outlet based in Kiev, says.
It's not independent. How can you call it independent after admitting you take 80% of your budget from the American government? It just doesn't make any sense.
You wouldn't be considered independent in the U.S., but I guess anything that's not Russian is considered independent by Reporters Without Borders, which I think itself is funded by Western states. But this says so much about the way the media works internationally, and it also hints at the real motive for Trump targeting USAID. But let's talk about Ukraine first. I mean, we've talked about this constantly. You're publishing a book at some point in the future about this.
At some point.
There was a coup in 2014 in Ukraine, and the country, sponsored by the U.S., in order to shift and reorient the country toward NATO and the EU, and anything that was remotely Russian was considered a hostile internal force and was effectively outlawed, which meant that 45% of the population were considered a Trojan horse for Russian interests. This meant major Ukrainian businessmen and politicians like Viktor Medvedchuk, who founded the Patriots for Life party in Ukraine and owned 3 major TV stations and media outlets, became effectively a criminal. He was criminalized. And after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which his party condemned, they were first and foremost a Ukrainian Russian-speaking population, mostly in the East. He was jailed and tortured by the Ukrainian SBU. But before that, the United States State Department under Joe Biden celebrated and supported and encouraged Vladimir Zelensky to ban all of those media outlets serving the Russian-speaking population. And what they did was they imposed on Ukraine a neo-colonial, pro-Western media ecosystem completely funded by USAID, where the messaging was also influenced by USAID. And what were they saying? Hromadski, for example, which sprouted up on the eve of the Maidan coup. They were pushing them towards war with Russia. Conflict, hate Russia, fight Russia, no economic cooperation with Russia. That's what USAID does. It drives us toward nuclear war. And also, Aaron, Ukraine was a key instrument in the, you can call it the deep state attempt to dislodge Donald Trump through impeachment. So I think one reason they're targeting it is because, you know, USAID, if they leave all these administrators in there who are liberals and hate Donald Trump, they can start creating scandals abroad through their mighty Wurlitzer of media outlets, whether it's in Georgia, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in Ukraine, where they just control all, like, so much of a country's media, as well as their NGOs, and they can turn this against Trump.
Yeah, and the irony, by the way, of the U.S. controlling so much of Ukrainian media is that, like, what is this proxy war supposed to be all about? It's supposed to be about helping Ukraine resist the takeover by Russia, being subsumed by Russia and its apparatus. Well, at the cost of being consumed totally by the U.S., being a U.S. proxy where the U.S. runs everything, to the point where your independent media outlets, so-called independent media, can't even survive without U.S. government funding. On the point about Medvedchuk, the Ukrainian, opposition leader who's close to Putin, the U.S. was so on board with cracking down on Medvedchuk's opposition party and his affiliated TV networks that an aide to Zelensky later admitted that after Medvedchuk's opposition TV channels were taken off of the air and there was this case brought against them, that this was a welcome gift for the Biden administration. So Zelensky conceived of this crackdown on this Russian ally in Ukraine as a welcome gift to Biden. That's how much Biden was pushing Ukraine towards this path of confrontation, to the point where Zelensky thought it would be a welcome gift for Biden to jail and take off the air the TV channels of his biggest rival, because Medvedchuk at that time was actually leading Zelensky in some polls. This is in early 2021, right after Biden takes office, which then sets Ukraine on the path to Russia's invasion 1 year later. And yeah, this absolutely, I think, is tied to Russiagate. Mark Ames has pointed this out. So many of these Ukrainian actors have been involved in spreading the claims that were used about to push the claims of Trump-Russia collusion and Russian interference. Ukraine's intelligence services played a key role in giving John Brennan, head of the CIA, so-called intelligence that was used for Russiagate, including the claim that Russia hacked the DNC. This only came out recently that Ukrainian intelligence was involved in that. So absolutely, the MAGA camp is now taking revenge on Ukraine for this. And so, yeah, Ukraine will be caught up in it. But overall, around the world, do I see Elon Musk really rolling back the programs that push U.S. hegemony via USAID? I'm doubtful of that. I think Ukraine is an exception because of its integral role in undermining Trump. But I suspect elsewhere we'll get a pass.
Yeah, I mean, what they'll ultimately do is move, if they can even pull it off, they would like to move USAID under the auspices of the State Department so it could be more easily controlled. And they'll privatize large parts of it and probably profit from contracts. But it's not as though it's going to go away. But it is amazing to see them gum up the works. And I do think they're serious about defunding a lot of these outlets, which serve no purpose to Trump and really are in the way of the deal that Trump wants to make over Ukraine. They're obstructing it.
Well, on that point, that's what I wonder now. I mean, Trump certainly has no interest in funding people who have undermined him. And this includes, for example, like Nina Jankowicz. You remember her, who was going to be the disinformation czar for Biden until her videos were just so embarrassing. She was totally caught up in this. She worked in Ukraine. She pushed these
she worked for Zelensky's campaign.
Exactly. So you have a huge overlap there that Trump and Elon Musk have no interest in funding. But then when it comes to reaching an overall goal, an overall deal in Ukraine, Trump talks about that, but is he actually going to, use the political capital to go up against neocon forces in Washington to push through some kind of peace deal in Ukraine that addresses Russian security concerns after so much money has been invested in fueling a proxy war simply because Biden refused to take NATO expansion off of the table? I can see Trump saying, yeah, we're not going to let Ukraine into NATO. I can see him doing that. But for example, is he going to agree to dismantle the so-called missile defense sites in Poland and Romania and to roll back NATO military infrastructure surrounding Russia as Russia has demanded? That part I doubt. And we're seeing Trump talk about it now. He's saying, like, to Ukraine, if you want us to keep funding you, we want your rare earth minerals. And that's his new message. And if he can get a promise from Ukraine to that effect, which I'm sure Zelensky is on board with, Zelensky is just a complete sellout to his own country, then I could see maybe Trump continuing this. Although then the question becomes, even if Ukraine does promise Trump access to its rare earth minerals, can it actually offer anything when Russia has taken control of the territory where those resources are?
Yeah, Poland is the site of Fort Trump. Don't think there's going to be much of a rollback of NATO there under Trump. This is happening right now at USAID headquarters. Josh Rogan, neocon propagandist, is complaining they're literally erasing USAID from the Ronald Reagan building. Reagan, a huge supporter of U.S. foreign assistance, must be turning in his grave. Oh, man, I wish I was there to see that.
Okay, well, listen, fair enough. So then I have to temper my skepticism of Musk. Like, if people like Josh Rogan are freaking out, I can only welcome that as a positive development and say that maybe actually they're onto something here, because, of course, Rogan represents the bipartisan neocon agenda. And if he's worried about Reagan turning in his grave, then that means actually
maybe that's revenge for the Contras and the raping of Salvadoran nuns and the Mujahideen creating Al-Qaeda. I don't know. If this can spiritually damage Reagan, that would be great. One of the worst presidents in American history. What are we paying for, though? I mean, like, it's a lot of money. Billions of dollars went to support media in the Republic of Georgia, like billions of dollars. This is not that I necessarily think that it would be great for American media, but this is while newsrooms across the U.S. are collapsing and being bought up and consolidated by corporate interests, which then sell them off to giant investment firms. There's no investment there. More money is being spent on regime change media abroad. And here's what Samantha Power said about where the money was going. She said this openly at an event that Anya Parampil and I attended in DC at a major theater in downtown DC, where they're rolling out this everything app for Ukrainians that USAID, in partnership with Visa and Uber and all of these other Silicon Valley firms, were aiming to force all Ukrainians to use in order to have vaccine passports and to report their neighbor to the SBU because they're a Russian spy through an app called E-Enemy, and to report Russian positions and have their passport and their digital ID in this utopia that we're creating in Ukraine. There was this admission from Samantha Power about where our money is going.
One of the things that Congress has given USAID since this full-scale invasion began is an unprecedented amount of money in direct budget support, which sounds kind of obvious. Of course, we would do that. We want to stand with Ukraine, but it's totally unprecedented, this kind of scale of investment. And we're talking along the lines of about $15 billion in a sense, cash to the Ukrainian government, which was famously corrupt, in past years, and still has work, as you noted, to do on corruption today.
So she's openly saying we've given unprecedented money to a famously corrupt government.
I don't know if we could have gotten that money out of Congress if not for DIA. Because what DIA allows us to do is that direct budget support goes, yes, to the Ukrainian government, but then it goes to pay teachers, to pay healthcare workers, to pay first responders. And there's a digital trail. It's not, some official deciding this or that. It actually is going directly into the bank accounts in a manner that it would have been untraceable in a prior regime.
So, let's just assume that the DIA app, makes it traceable and transparent and not corrupt. We're still paying the salaries of Ukrainian teachers. And how are teachers doing in the United States? Why are we doing that? We weren't doing that before Maidan. We kind of were, but not on the same scale. Why do we have to pay Ukrainian first responders and paying like pensions for Ukrainians? Like, have you seen what the United States looks like now? There's like a legitimate anger about USAID. Yeah. And Elon is marketing it as, you know, there's drag shows they're paying for, and they are. I mean, they're literally paying for like trans comic books and drag shows around the world. It's really happening, but you know, that's peanuts compared to what they're doing that we know about, which is much more scandalous. That's just a way of marketing it to like the low IQ MAGA online Neanderthal that's just like, well, they're going to come and traffic our children, you know.
And there's the problem with Democrats, the progressive Democrats like Bernie Sanders. They should have been leading the call and saying, why are we funding the pensions and salaries of Ukrainian teachers when we don't pay ours? But they didn't.
Yeah.
They all voted to fund this actually in lockstep, which is a huge lost opportunity, because who else is going to advance a progressive agenda calling for spending money actually on, you know, teachers here? It's not going to be Elon Musk, obviously. They want to cut the Department of Education. So progressives lost a huge opportunity to call this out. And instead they voted for it. And there was just very little questions about it, including from progressive media. On the issue of corruption in Ukraine, I mean, I've stopped paying attention to the stories about it because it's just, everyone knows now there's so much corruption. But one anecdote that I recently caught my eye was Ukraine's chief military psychiatrist was arrested on allegations that he amassed more than $1 million since the beginning of Russia's invasion, including multiple properties and at least 4 BMWs. So that's like the chief military psychiatrist being arrested. And you know, for everyone who gets caught, you don't know how many people are just making out like bandits. And this is all paid for by U.S. taxpayers.
Yeah. A little isolationism in the Democratic Party would go a long way. Why are we paying Matt Duss's salary in Bernie's office? I mean, we pay for those tools like in congressional staffers.
And I'm sorry, and I forgot to mention the most important thing. Zelensky recently admitted that, you know, there's been like more than $177 billion allocated by the U.S. to Ukraine, and Zelensky said, we've only received $77 billion of this. I don't know where all the money is. That was Zelensky's admission. I won't play the clip because we'll have to translate it. But yeah, he said that I don't know where half of this money is. So even Zelensky doesn't know.
Lex Friedman as well in English.
Okay. Well,
listen.
So Zelensky openly admits that, oh yeah, like we haven't seen half of this money that's been allocated towards us. And maybe the explanation there is that, yeah, because all that money went to U.S. defense contractors. So that's why Zelensky didn't see it. But if it was actually allocated for Ukraine and Zelensky saying, yeah, I don't know where half of it is, like what does that say about just how much money has gone into corruption and greed that we'll never even know about?
Well, it's mainly our corruption. It's what I was saying before. Like, this is the post-World War II economy. We create these wars and then launder money that's washed from the pockets of the U.S. taxpayer through the conflict area, Afghanistan. Where'd all that money go? Ukraine, where'd all that money go? Of course, it gets siphoned off by the local honchos, the local warlords. But most of it goes back to contractors in the U.S. And so they need war. And the masters of violence are effectively in charge of our society. Palantir, Peter Thiel, and Alex Karp. I mean, the AI warlords, those guys are basically in charge of the Trump administration. So that's what it's about. That's what Zelensky's talking about. USAID is, of course, part of that. The international development industry just creates so much waste and corruption. And I guess they went after it because it's an easy target. It's great to have this. It's a teachable moment. That's what you get, with Trump. There's no endorsement of his agenda. I mean, I think so much of this is about privatization. But with Trump, you get so many more teachable moments where clarity about US empire suddenly appears, and more of the American public begins to understand it's not working in their favor. I mean, why would any red-blooded American want to pay for the BBC? This is treason. This is literal treason. Whoever wrote this grant should be tried for treason. Did you know the third largest funder of the BBC's charitable arm is USAID? This is journalist Matt Kennard. This isn't, this is from December 2024, December 18th, my birthday. I missed it because I was having such a great time. I missed this tweet. The U.S. government agency gives £2 million per year, which is like what, $3 million a year, to the BBC. The organization works in partnership with BBC World Service, local media in 35 countries to mentor and train journalists, which basically means to make them into like good Western propagandists. And you can see here that is documented. I mean, that it shouldn't be happening. We should just pay less taxes instead of giving money to Ukrainian media, the BBC, Nicaraguan media. I probably don't have time to feature it, but at the Grayzone, we produced a short documentary about a Nicaraguan television station called 100% Noticias, 100% News, which was funded by USAID. And in 2018, during the months-long coup to dislodge the popularly elected socialist-oriented Sandinista government in Nicaragua, one of the largest workers' movements in the Western Hemisphere as their base, through violence, shutting down the country, destroying the economy, torturing and murdering people at checkpoints. 100% Noticias featured calls for murdering the president, Daniel Ortega, and his wife, calls for people to come out in the streets and riot, to attack their neighbors who were Sandinistas, which was happening every day. They were making heroes out of the criminal class of Nicaragua that was torturing people. And this was funded by USAID. And then when the station was shut down, all the fake journalists, press freedom groups, Committee to Protect Journalists came out and complained that this was Daniel Ortega's evil repression, as if the United States would have permitted Russia and China to hype up riots in their, that went well beyond anything we saw with BLM in their own cities. They wouldn't have tolerated it. Actually, the directors of that station were released in a deal to maybe relieve sanctions on Nicaragua. I can't remember what the deal was. But, I mean, we're talking about the encouragement of violence, killing by USAID. This will never be brought up. Violence in the service of regime change to produce more free market governments, of course. This will never be brought up by Elon Musk. He'll never mention Juan Guaido making off with all the money. It would be great if they went after Juan Guaido, but that would offend the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is involved in the whole Juan Guaido regime change sham. But the Venezuelan opposition is furious right now at Guaido and Carlos Vecchio, his fake ambassador in Washington, for making off with USAID money. This is our money to create a fake government in Venezuela that became cover for stealing Citgo, the largest foreign asset of the Venezuelan government, starving it of cash, and then producing one of the worst migration crises in recent history, flooding the U.S. with Venezuelan migrants who were fleeing a country whose economy had been destroyed by the U.S. They got TPS, and then they became the scapegoat for Donald Trump to get elected. And now they're all being sent home. I don't know if there's going to be any sanctions relief, but USAID was at the center of this through Juan Guaido. This is not aiding people. Those people could have used aid. They could have used an actual economy and a healthcare system, but we blocked it. And USAID was involved. It was at the forefront of the coup attempt and the fake humanitarian aid stunt on the Venezuelan-Colombian border. It trained Juan Guaido. It trained all of his lackeys. It paid the Venezuelan opposition and ultimately helped create this migration crisis. And, Elon Musk is onto something when he says they're funding like drag shows and stuff like that. We discovered this in our look at the International Republican Institute. We'll have a new piece up about this later today. Yeah, Republicans, MAGA and leftists should unite against USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy. The International Republican Institute is a subsidiary of the National Endowment for Democracy, the regime change arm of the US government, which works hand in glove with USAID. And they paid rappers, artists, actors, and sponsored quote unquote transgender dance performances to, in their own words, destabilize Bangladesh's politics. And these are documents that we helped uncover. That was a tweet by Wyatt Reed of the Grayzone. Here it is. Transgender dance performance, which featured 100 visitors attended the program, including local officials and members of the U.S. Embassy. Now, there's nothing wrong. I'm not condemning transgender dance performances per se, but why should U.S. taxpayers pay for them to sponsor regime change in a place where we don't even understand? Well, no Americans are even couldn't even understand what's happening. Sheikh Hasina was put in power. Was displaced from power because she had rejected a U.S. military base in Bangladesh. And Mohammed Yunus was put in power as president, who was on the payroll of the Clinton Foundation and was a microloan shark. So that's what happened there. But I'm saying we exposed this in Cuba as well at the Grayzone. USAID was paying rappers in Cuba to promote regime change, grooming rappers, and grooming the Afro-Cuban population to pit them against the Cuban revolutionary government as the U.S. sanctions Cuba's government to death. USAID did that. So any leftist who supports Cuba's revolution, who's outraged by what Elon is doing to USAID, is a socialist and a fake leftist.
One point I want to stress is that USAID, NED, it's not just used to fund, propaganda directed at foreign societies. It's also used to fund propaganda directed at U.S. taxpayers to manufacture consent for U.S. foreign policy, for regime change, for all these proxy wars. And one of the ways they do it is they fund so-called civil society in these targeted countries that happens to align with U.S. foreign policy goals. So just here's one example. This is Democracy Now! Recently interviewing somebody from what's called the Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties, okay? And they're going to argue against what else but diplomacy with Russia.
People in Ukraine want peace much more than anyone else because the war is horrible. But peace doesn't come when country which was invaded stop resisting to Russian aggression. That's not peace. That's occupation. And occupation is horrible. It's just the same war, but in another form, because Russian occupation means torture, rapes, enforced disappearances, denial of your own identity, forcible adoption of your children, filtration camps, and mass graves. And that's why we have no other choice, because if we stop resisting to Russian aggression, it will be no more us. People in Ukraine want peace.
So note there, the Chiron identifies that speaker as a Ukrainian human rights lawyer, Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties. It sounds, it sounds great. It sounds like really benign. And who wouldn't support civil liberties? But what Democracy Now! Doesn't inform its audience is that the Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties is funded by USAID. And this is like an openly admitted thing. USAID calls that same lawyer the head of the USAID supported Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties. USAID has helped more than 50 civil society organizations, including the Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties. And she's even a recipient, or she's even on the steering committee of what's called the World Movement for Democracy, which is a project of the National Endowment for Democracy, a notorious front for the CIA. And so American audiences, even a progressive audience, in the case of Democracy Now!, get presented with people from these benign sounding groups, Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties, and they failed and I don't know why Democracy Now! Didn't disclose this. Maybe they didn't know. they're funded by the same U.S. government programs that support regime change around the world as Democracy Now! Used to expose a long time ago. And that's how it works. Is like you fund people in foreign countries with these benign sounding groups, and the U.S. population that's footing the bill isn't informed that actually they're funded by their own government.
Well, I don't think Democracy Now! Would inform their viewers even if they knew. And why are they pushing that pro-war propaganda so constantly? But this goes back to my point that USAID has created this media ecosystem in Ukraine and other countries. If Donald Trump does make a move toward diplomacy, we will get more of that propaganda in the US unless those groups are defunded. So it makes sense politically for him to defund them. I mean, why would you pay for a rival political network to attack you and undermine your agenda abroad? And that's all they do. That's what they exist for. You know, there are real jobs. I mean, there should be real jobs there. We could pay them to, I don't know, after making peace, pay them to clear minefields and dispose of explosives. They wanted those explosives. They're part of the increasing minority of the population that wanted those explosives. It makes sense politically. So I'm here for it. Aaron, I know you have like a hard stop coming up, but I also know you wanted to revel in the OPCW whistleblowers getting a shout out in U.S. Congress. So
I did. Tulsi Gabbard made history recently by, for the first time in the U.S. government setting, acknowledging the existence of the OPCW whistleblowers. This came when Arizona Senator Mark Kelly was trying to grill her for daring to question allegations that the former government of Syria, led by Bashar al-Assad, used chemical weapons, and she brought up the OPCW whistleblowers, and that was a very important moment. And you pointed this out. Also, for the first time in the U.S. government setting, somebody acknowledged the scandal that was the U.S. dirty war in Syria, in which the U.S. openly sided with an al-Qaeda-dominated insurgency. And Tulsi Gabbard gave a very searing response also to Mark Kelly about that, calling this out for the first time ever in a U.S. government setting, that this dirty war that entailed the U.S. siding with al-Qaeda was acknowledged. In her opening statement at the hearing, Tulsi Gabbard quoted that Jake Sullivan email that we always quote from February 2012 to Hillary Clinton: Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. That was the first time anyone has ever, I think, quoted that email in a U.S. government setting. And this is what Tulsi Gabbard said to Mark Kelly about her opposition to that dirty war.
Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Colonel Gabbard, when Russia was denying us use of chemical weapons, they accused the U.S. of supporting terrorists. This is a line that Putin used frequently during the Syrian civil war as he supported Assad. Syrian officials made similar comments. They did it repeatedly. They did it in public. They did it at the United Nations. In 2016, you gave an interview in which you said, and this is a quote, "The U.S. is providing direct and indirect support to terrorist groups in order to overthrow the Syrian government." And in 2019, on the Democratic presidential debate stage, you said of President Trump, this is a quote, "This current president is continuing to betray us. We were supposed to be going after al-Qaeda, but over years now, not only have we not gone after al-Qaeda, our president is supporting al-Qaeda." So I'm interested to hear, what was your goal in saying these things? And did you consider, before saying them, the motives of Iran and Russia, what their motives might have been before making these claims?
Senator, as someone who enlisted in the military specifically because of al-Qaeda's terrorist attack on 9/11 and committing myself and my life to doing what I could to defeat these terrorists, it was shocking and a betrayal to me and every person who was killed on 9/11, their families and my brothers and sisters in uniform. When, as a member of Congress, I learned about President Obama's dual programs that he had begun really to overthrow the regime of Syria, and being willing to, through the CIA's Timber Sycamore program that has now been made public, of working with and arming and equipping al-Qaeda in an effort to overthrow that regime, starting yet another regime change war in the Middle East. DoD train and equip program, again, begun under President Obama, is widely been known, looked at, and studied, that ultimately resulted in over $500 million being used to train who they called moderate rebels, but were actually fighters working with and aligned with al-Qaeda's affiliate on the ground in Syria, all to move forward with their regime change and not acknowledging what was obvious at the time and what has unfortunately borne true, which was that a regime change war in Syria, much like the regime change wars in Iraq, the toppling of Gaddafi and Mubarak, while these are all dictators, would likely result in the rise of Islamist extremists like al-Qaeda taking power. I shed no tears for the fall of the Assad regime, but today we have an Islamist extremist who is now in charge of Syria, as I said, who danced on the streets to celebrate the 9/11 attack, who ruled over Idlib with an Islamist extremist governance, and who has already begun to persecute and kill and arrest religious minorities like Christians in Syria.
I understand.
Why that should be acceptable to anyone is beyond me.
It
is certainly
and
not in our
interest. I
interest.
appreciate your answer, and thank you. My concern has to do with the tendency to repeat Russian and Syrian, and even in some cases, I think we'll get into in the closed session, Iranian information, and to discount what comes from our intelligence community.
So that really captures it right there. Notice he can't challenge a single thing substantively that Tulsi Gabbard says about the reality of the dirty war in Syria, where the U.S. enabled an al-Qaeda-dominated insurgency that has now taken over Syria. He's only upset that it happens to coincide with Iranian, Chinese, Russian talking points, and therefore you're not allowed to say it out loud. Tulsi Gabbard did say it out loud, and that's why she's been hated, and there's so much to criticize her for. She smeared anti-genocide protesters. She's abandoned her previous statements on Israel-Palestine that were a lot more fair-minded. But it's just a fact that she stands alone inside U.S. political circles to call it the dirty war in Syria, and that's why when she called it out in a congressional setting, Mark Kelly's only rebuttal is that he's mad that what she's saying happens to comport with what Russia and China and Iran also say.
Yeah, you're echoing Russian propaganda. Well, can it never be true? And is it only Russian propaganda because U.S. propagandists deny it? So he had nothing to say, but it was also just amazing for the American public to be introduced. Again, as I said before, there are so many teachable moments in the Trump era. And one of them is that the US public was introduced, a national audience was introduced really for the first time to what I think was one of the greatest scandals in the 21st century. Like one of the crimes of the century was that billions of dollars were channeled into flooding Syria with weapons so that ISIS and Al-Qaeda could advance. And USAID was a big part of that. They created the civil administration in any area where Al-Qaeda and its allies, Al-Qaeda being Jabhat al-Nusra, which was controlled by the current Syrian president, self-appointed Syrian president, really a dictator, Mohammed Jolani, aka Ahmad al-Sharaa. USAID created his civil administration and helped give him credibility. They funded the White Helmets, the Syrian White Helmets, who made it, appear as though anywhere Nusra was attacking, people were just pure victims there, or chemical attacks were occurring. Media, Syrian quote unquote independent media funded by USAID would make it seem as though the so-called rebels who then controlled Idlib were running a really tight ship and a technocratic administration by promoting their good works. And here we are with regime change, proving the point we've been making and the point that Colonel Tulsi Gabbard has been making and was vilified for making when she was in Congress, which was that all of this U.S. money was going to lead to the founder of Syrian Al-Qaeda, the former deputy founder of ISIS, becoming president. It's really like such a shocking scandal, and nothing is said about it anymore. So whatever happens there, that was remarkable. I do think she'll be confirmed. Todd Young, the Indiana senator, was on the fence, has come around. I don't know what concessions she's making.
Well, she's, supported 702. She's, so walked back her views on mass surveillance. But look, she did not back off, refusing to call Edward Snowden a traitor. She could have said, so many people, like Michael Bennett, demanded she call Edward Snowden a traitor. If she had done that, it would have made her path to confirmation a lot easier. She refused to do that. She declined. She should have told them a more direct answer. She avoided the question, which I thought was a mistake. She could have said, well, listen, Edward Snowden hasn't been charged with treason. If you think she's a traitor, then ask the U.S. government to charge him with being a traitor, which neither the first Trump administration or the Obama administration or the Biden administration ever did. So no one's ever charged him with treason. So why? I'm supposed to be an intelligence official. I'm not a court. I'm not the DOJ. So take it up with them. But she instead avoided the question. But to her credit, she didn't cater to their demand.
Yeah, I was impressed. I was impressed that because Snowden himself said, "Go ahead and call me a traitor. Just get in there."
No, she didn't. And she didn't back down on, she also could have sold out the OPCW whistleblowers, but she actually invoked them and said they raised important questions and they deserve to be heard. And that's so important in a U.S. government that has silenced the OPCW whistleblowers to the point where they're never, ever acknowledged, both by the U.S. government and corporate media, which refuses to acknowledge their existence. So Tulsi Gabbard even mentioning their existence was a huge slap in the face to this Orwellian oath of silence on the OPCW whistleblowers, because what they exposed with the cover-up of their investigation in Duma was so important and is so fundamental to the U.S. narrative that justifies war and sanctions on Syria.
Fun
I got to
fact.
jump out. Yeah,
Fun
I got to
fact.
jump out.
All right, Aaron, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
See you soon.
It's just me. Fun fact. Senator Michael Bennett's father, Douglas Bennett, was a high-level USAID administrator who had, there's a lot of declassified correspondences between him and CIA officials on the CIA website. He was a State Department administrator as well. And, while people can't be blamed for the sins of their father, they can be if they're even more pro-war. I mean, the Tulsi hearings to me were also a great forum for reminding me why the Democrats are so odious, how they've become so thoroughly neoconservative, particularly the 3 or 4 Democrats who are browbeating Tulsi Gabbard constantly over calling Edward Snowden a traitor. I mean, wasn't what Edward Snowden exposed about mass surveillance the real crime? Why is he the criminal? They're just there on the Intelligence Committee to protect the intelligence services. Something I learned from CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou, the only man who was actually prosecuted for the Bush torture program, not because he tortured anyone, but because he exposed it, was that there's a Democrat and a Republican CIA officer who are assigned to the Senate Intelligence Committee, and they basically provide the instructions to the senators there. I mean, do you think Kirsten Gillibrand, Mark Kelly has some kind of military background, but do you think Kirsten Gillibrand is just coming up with this on her own? No. And Tom Cotton, by the way, was the chair of the Intelligence Committee. It's another interesting development of the Trump era. Tom Cotton is a product. He was like a poster child of the neoconservative movement. He first emerged on Powerline blog, which is like a key neocon blog during the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, when he was in the Iraq War. He was writing for it. Then he was promoted. He was funded by Paul Singer, the neocon billionaire, who was also funding like Commentary magazine and all kinds of never Trump interests. But Tom Cotton on the Intelligence Committee was Tulsi Gabbard's strongest advocate, was defending her. He's virulently pro in every theater. Why is that happening? It's because Tom Cotton is now facing pressure from his own constituents in Arkansas, which has a very strong MAGA constituency. It's a southern red, deep red state. And they have basically lit up his phone lines and told him, if you vote against Tulsi Gabbard, we're not going to support you anymore. So with Trump, you actually have grassroots pressure on these senators, which wouldn't have existed under a Republican Mitt Romney or George W. Bush administration to the same degree. That's kind of what MAGA brings to the table. And that's a major reason why Tulsi Gabbard's being confirmed and why Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is being confirmed as well. The whole MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again movement, is a grassroots lobbying force. Don't know if the Democrats have anything similar to overcome the preponderance of power of the intelligence services, big pharma, or other interests that are opposed to these nominees. Of course, Bernie has been absolutely pathetic, voting for Marco Rubio to be confirmed, but opposing Tulsi Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy. Tulsi Gabbard came up under Bernie's wing. She was part of Bernie Sanders for America. So before we part, just wanted to make everyone aware of what's happening in Hitler's birthplace of Austria. In Austria, the Austrian Secret Service, state security, is targeting a journalist who's a friend of this show, Richard Medhurst, who we've had on to discuss being raided by the British counterterror police. Here's Richard Medhurst. I was detained this week by the Austrian police and intelligence services. They raided my house, office, and took all my devices. They're accusing me of being a member of Hamas and threatened me with 10 years in prison. Journalism is not a crime. We'll listen to like a portion of Richard's message.
My name is Richard Medhurst. I'm an internationally accredited journalist from the UK. On Monday, agents from the Austrian police and intelligence services detained me, raided my home, raided my studio, and then interrogated me. They essentially lured me into a trap. So I received a letter from the government last week from immigration, summoning me for some interview at my residency. I found that a bit odd because I've lived here for a while. I never had any problems. So having nothing to fear, I went to the meeting by myself. And then after a few simple questions, they suddenly issued a thinly veiled threat saying they were considering revoking my residency because of my alleged reporting on Palestine and Lebanon. So of course, my answer was no comment. And as soon as I thought everything was over, I was ambushed by a group of plainclothes agents. They entered the room, flashing their badges in my face, and they said that they were the Austrian equivalent of MI5 or the FBI. They detained me, and then they served me with a warrant from the state prosecutor to search my home, search my studio, take all of my devices. Why? Because they think that I, a Christian Englishman, am a member of Hamas. Yes, you heard that correctly. They are accusing me of being a member of Hamas, of being part of the Izz al-Din Qassam brigades, of disseminating propaganda, encouraging terrorism, being affiliated with organized crime and a terrorist group. I mean, it's like reading something out of the Twilight Zone. So they seized my phone, and they drove me to my residence, ransacked the place. They even took devices which I repeatedly told them do not belong to me. Then they drove me to my studio and turned the place upside down. So I had to watch my devices being disassembled before my very eyes by a group of strangers. All these tools that I spent years building and investing in, the core of my journalistic profession. They took, in total, they took like 5-6 different laptops and computers, phones, USB sticks, hard drives, DVDs, you name it. And although the warrant was for electronic devices only, for some reason, they took photos of my residence, photos of the office, of the bathroom. They helped themselves to anything they saw: books, papers, documents, cupboards, closets. To tell you the truth, though, the agents treated me kindly and with respect. They didn't deny me any of my basic needs. Now, as you recall, I was unjustly arrested a few months ago in London. They jailed me for almost 24 hours under the Terrorism Act. Strangely enough, last week, the police in England again extended this investigation. And then suddenly this happens in Vienna. I don't think that is mere coincidence, okay? The first thing I asked the Austrian agents was, did my government put you up to this? And they replied, no, Britain doesn't talk to us. Well, forgive me, but I find that a bit hard to believe. I do think that this persecution, this raid, is related to the case in Britain. I think it's being coordinated with Britain. Now, my colleague, Stefania Marizzi, who works on the Snowden papers with Glenn Greenwald, she reported last month in Il Fatto Quotidiano that the British police seized a graphene OS device from me and that it was very unlikely that they'd be able to crack it. So I suppose that's why Britain asked the Austrians to raid me, grab anything they could find, and go on this massive fishing expedition. You know, the warrant even mentions my arrest in London to try and bolster their case. The Austrian agents, they asked me for the passwords to my devices, and I said no, because as a journalist, I have an ethical, a professional obligation to protect my sources. None of them were compromised. During the raid, I spoke briefly with the techs who were extracting my devices, you know, from one nerd to another. And they told me that if they can't crack the devices, they send them outside sometimes to other countries, to other law enforcement agencies, and ask them for help. So that further indicated to me that this could very well be related to what's happening in the UK against me. Now,
sorry, I was muted. That's what's happening across Western Europe now. Richard is not the only one. There are too many to name who have been raided, who have been faced state repression for their views on Palestine, for their stated views on Palestine, for speaking positively of the resistance, for example. 12 days before Richard was raided, Ali Abu Nima, the founder of Electronic Intifada, one of the first online Palestine solidarity-oriented journalistic newsletters in the US, was arrested violently on the streets of Zurich under the orders of the local interior minister, who himself, as we discussed before, was a pro-Israel zealot. And Ali was just simply going to give a talk to the local Palestine committee about Gaza. And he was treated as some kind of terrorist and deported, investigated for terrorism. Britain has passed this new terrorism act. You're not allowed to praise Hamas or Hezbollah. And that appears to be what Richard is being prosecuted or investigated for in the UK. And now the investigation has crossed borders into Austria. This is targeting journalists for their views. And as Igor Bohm, who is an Austrian citizen, pointed out, Austria's government has elevated Hamas to the same level as the Nazis by further tightening its National Prohibition Act, originally aimed at denazification of Austria by punishing any trivialization or relativization of the Nazi Holocaust or other Nazi crimes against humanity. Anyone who publicly wears Nazi badges or Hamas symbols in the future could be punished equally severely. Legislation of this ilk is instilled as a backup in case the power to rationalize Israel's mass murder campaign fails to fulfill its primary function to keep the public minds from being cluttered with inconvenient facts. That's a pretty good analysis of some highly authoritarian pro-Israel laws that have been passed in Austria, which now equate resistance to Israel with Nazism and criminalize anyone who opposes Israel, which really brings home the point that Israel is one of Israel and the Israel lobby, the Zionist movement that is pushing for these laws, poses an existential threat to freedoms that have been taken for granted in the West, particularly in the United States. They pose the most direct threat to the First Amendment. And we're going to see more and more attacks on it in the United States from the Republican Congress and even possibly from the Trump Justice Department, which has been supported and cheered on by so many fake free speech warriors. But it's important to send your support to Richard Medhurst. He's being hounded all around the so-called Garden of Europe for his journalism, for his words, for his opinions. The mask of liberal democracy is off. And those of you who participate in Palestine solidarity activities, who have organized against the genocide, the Holocaust of our time in Gaza, be careful when you go to Western Europe. Richard installed Graphene OS on his phone to prevent I guess it was the British police from hacking into his phone, and it succeeded in preventing them from hacking into his phone. And that's why they're hounding him, because he won't let them into his devices, but they will hack into your devices. They're summoning virtually every activist I know there in the UK for some kind of police interview now. They're freaking out, and they're throwing away their values that they have professed since World War II, their values of liberal democracy, for a psychotic little apartheid state called Israel. That's what they're willing to do, to shut us up. Anyway, we've learned a lot today. We've learned that Trump didn't get a golden shower at the Ritz Hotel in Moscow, but he got something much worse, which was a golden pager from blood-stained war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. As always, I hope that you like this stream, and hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't. Subscribe to us on Rumble, and support us in any way you see fit. But it's been great having you here, and we'll see you next week. Peace.